Everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to the colloquium. Quick reminder before we get going that Data Salon happens tomorrow with Doc and Bruce Schneider. So if you haven't had the opportunity to register for that, please feel free to go to the workshop site and do that. But I get the pleasure of introducing today someone that is quite honestly legendary, in my opinion, in this building, because Dr. Madelyn Sanfilippo has been now with the workshop in various ways, in various iterations. And for those of you who have been involved either with the Knowledge Commons along the way or data protection and the program, she's someone that I cite nonstop and enjoy every conversation that I'm fortunate enough to have with her. I'm really looking forward to the conversation about the polycentric governance for data protection and the 4 examples that are in here. I'm gonna turn it over and I will be moderating things as we move along. So thank you for being here.
I am happy to be back as an Indiana alumna, but also to get to speak with all of you today. This is a project that I really enjoyed working on as an assistant professor. I rarely get the chance to do things that are not with my students, so this has been sort of a multi-year project just for myself, which is fun. And this is an interesting, I think, opportunity to present to folks who are going to be very knowledgeable about the conceptual pieces in a way that the folks I usually speak to, I am, teaching them. This is what an institutional grammar is. This is what we mean by polycentricity. So I want to start by talking about how this project really emerged. I work on a lot of data governance related projects that, surface the challenges when we have conflicts between sectoral privacy approaches. In the US, rather than something really comprehensive as we see in many other parts of the world, we treat, health data privacy very differently than financial data privacy. And instances when those intersect are rife with conflict and ambiguity and uncertainty for the folks who actually have to resolve those things. In addition to that approach, we have, a handful of states that are leading the way in more comprehensive approaches, but not necessarily doing it in the same way. And that's only in addition to all of the complexity around local approaches to privacy that are already on the books. There's 143 different educational privacy laws across the United States. I'm in Illinois and we talk about BIPA a lot, biometric approaches. We think about sort of anti-surveillance ordinances in particular metropolitan areas. And all of these things are intersecting with technologies that are not just national, but global and not really well equipped to sort through what local needs and challenges are going to exist. And so we've got this discrepancy between what the rules on the books are, what is happening in use, and what actually needs to be reconciled. And one of the ways that is often addressed is through data protection agreements or addendums to vendor contracts. And so over the course of, I suppose, 5 years at this point, I have been collecting as many DPAs as I can get my hands on. I had hoped to give you an example from Indiana, but IU does not make those publicly available. So if anyone has access and would like to, exactly. I would love to see that. Instead, I give here an example of what this looks like from the University of Michigan. So chosen because as a Big Ten alum, I know we can all get behind aggressively disliking them today, particularly in light of the controversy in the past week around selling student data, whether or not that's valid and whether or not students agreed to the ways in which recordings and assignments and exams will be used to train AI is somewhat uncertain given what's been reported and what university officials are saying. But it also comes in really stark contrast to what they say is happening when you look at the documents that are publicly available and that were made available to me via research interviews. This tells me two things. First, that these documents are a really important window into what should be happening, but also what should be happening is still not necessarily what's actually happening. And the loopholes and places where there is hedging language and uncertainty that can be identified both qualitatively and quantitatively in these documents tends to point to where there are future data flows to keep our eyes on. And so what I'm trying to do in the paper that many of you, I imagine, have seen, is to understand how these contractual addenda resolve the sort of competing governance parameters, but also dysfunctional governance parameters. I think one of the spaces where this is especially evident is in library and educational DPAs in states that have a series of many laws that seem to have conflicts over one another. It's not necessarily speaking about cross-domain or cross-place sorts of problems, but the fact that, say, Indiana, for example, didn't necessarily repeal or modify educational privacy law. They simply passed another cross-cutting law that then someone else needs to sort out. And so I'm trying to understand, first of all, how well these work, where they are successful, where they hit stumbling blocks, and how this is possible without changing the sort of original content of terms of service or vendor agreements that have been signed. And so to do that, part of what I'm keeping in mind is how these contexts overlap in reality. We're not merely thinking about the sectors, as I mentioned, but rather all of those small spaces of intersections. I'm also sort of drawing on kind of broader and longstanding polycentric theory in order to think through how exactly can we describe a particular arrangement. This is not a situation where we're looking at, a few hundred DPAs that are all within the same set of polycentric arrangements, but rather some which are relational, some that have some degree of complementarity, and others that are really highly redundant and dysfunctional. And I think one final piece of background that makes this case especially interesting and challenging to sort through is that unlike lots of other areas of public policy, we also have to grapple with the technical aspects themselves and infrastructure. And I realize the workshop, since I have been here, has grown in ways where lots of you deal with this all the time. But for, again, many of the other folks I speak to, that piece is often the one they don't consider. That even if, social norms and market forces and legal constraints or supports might align in a particular case, the infrastructure and design themselves still need to actually support that. And a lot of times what people expect normatively and what the law says are either not technically possible or undermine things that are critical to privacy and security in other ways. So I'm approaching all of this through the lens of contextual privacy. I've had wonderful and thoughtful comments already from folks who have read the paper via email. And I think one key background piece that I want us to all keep in mind is that the paper is intentionally descriptive rather than normative, in part because I can't tell these communities, I can't tell these particular groups of people what are reasonable normative expectations for their privacy. That's sort of up to them. This is a really nice descriptive approach that takes into account context, somewhat analogously to action arenas, but also the sort of standards, patterns, expectations, values and interactions that different groups or social categories experience and negotiate every day. So as an example, this is an approach that sort of deconstructs particular information flows in terms of parameters. Again, somewhat like the institutional grammar. It's telling us who are the information senders, subjects and recipients as actors? What is the sort of attribute or information type that might be relevant in a particular flow? And then what is the transmission principle? Essentially, what are the aims, conditions, deontic logic, and consequences that prescribe where and when this would be appropriate? And so this example sort of illustrates, something I think we can relate to. For those of us who are interacting with a medical provider, we are willing to share, past medical records, particular details of our current symptoms or experiences under a transmission principle of confidentiality. Without that, we probably wouldn't share those things. We have an about whom or what, what is being collected, and who is sending it. Where is that going? What is actually within that information? Is this anonymized details that are being reported to someone? Is this very specific test results and so on? And then what are the constraints that make that appropriate? And so in a lot of my work, I integrate the institutional grammar and contextual integrity to specifically think about knowledge commons governance and how that might be prescribed, breaking up what the institutional grammar folks would think of in terms of attributes, in terms of contextual integrity, and on the privacy end, breaking up a transmission principle in order to structurally see, is this enforced? Is this normative? Is this, purely a strategy? And this is really where these documents started to surface for me in studies throughout the pandemic related to the adoption of all sorts of new ed tech policies nationwide as people grappled with proctoring, Zoom licensing, and more recently, as we think about the ways in which the data generated through some of these services are being used to train generative AI. What are the local constraints that people need to pose? Because if we look at the generalist license, if we look at the privacy policies that are provided, they only nominally point to sort of federal domain specific laws. They highlight lots of exemptions. At our discretion, we might choose to do something differently, and this will update all the time. And how are organizations, in this case, universities, school districts, libraries, financial institutions, and hospitals, actually keeping up with all of those changes in order to ensure that they are not in violation of their obligations due to choices their vendors might make and changes that come along. And so over the course of a series of projects that were focused very broadly on data governance, I've amassed this really lovely data set of DPAs. In some cases, multiple versions, as some of them have had to deal with changes, and have the relative context for that. What privacy policies or terms of use might also be associated, what contracts are available from these organizations in addition to the contractual addenda, and sort through this at both a qualitative and computational set of methods to content analysis in order to try to surface things like where is hedging language or uncertainty that can be modeled. How does that map on to particular information flows that have been defined? What actors are responsible for different things, and where are there obligations that are still being left to the discretion of individual users who may not know that DPA exists, or even that DPAs exist at all, in order to sort of think through what are the broad information flows, where are processes of institutionalization happening, how are they helping to resolve some of the polycentric conflicts that we see, and how is this helping to deal with issues of compliance, particularly when we think about some of the institutions here that wear multiple hats. If we think through things like universities that may have a university hospital, they're, educating and healthcare and dealing with financial data, and a lot of times dealing with security data, depending on the sorts of grants and different departments that might be specializations in those places. So I want to start by highlighting a handful of prominent concepts that we see here. Across all of these areas, there's a lot of emphasis on the sort of legislation that is important. Certainly at the high level, we see this more so with federal regulation, but if you go down, you see state by state, different state bills that are mentioned, local ordinances that might be involved. And this is very, very starkly different than things like the privacy policies that might only mention GDPR or CCPA once or twice in, many thousands of words. We also see a lot of sort of key governance terms. We see, for example, in the financial DPAs, specific standards that are cited. We see, auditing and enforcement mechanisms that are mentioned by name. This is not, left up to some ambiguous catch-all phrase of, and you will need to monitor this, but rather there are very clear parameters as to who is responsible for this and what they need to look at. The third sort of category that I think is important that we see here across all of the cases are terms that are really prominent in data governance. So in addition to researching this is a space that I teach in, and it frankly looked, as I started to model the topics and look at keywords that were coming up, that this was almost mapping onto a glossary or something in a textbook for data governance. They're talking about, retention and access limitations and constraints and controls. There's discussion about where data is hosted and whether or not that needs to be localized, how you deal with cross-border data flows around healthcare and finance. And this is really promising because this is a lot more information than we would typically have a window into if we looked at things like a privacy policy instead. As we try to understand concretely what the differences are across these different cases, it's clear that the sorts of information flows they're concerned about are relatively different. We see, libraries and education that are concerned about exports and what might happen. In particular, a lot of the library concerns are sort of worried or speaking to national security interests and the sorts of tensions that have existed around surveillance and intellectual freedom. Now, increasingly, some of these documents speak to sort of concerns about whether or not data would be available to conservative activists or parents' rights groups, which is a bit different than what we've seen over the past 25 years. Sort of post 9/11 security concerns. Education, of course, being concerned about, the extent to which students can or cannot consent to these things and the sort of necessity of depending on these technical infrastructures. In contrast, finance speaks a lot more to import of third-party data. They're speaking to, how analytics are used to assess fitness for loans or, the ways in which particularly large financial institutions and fintech would have access to very diverse forms of data that are not traditionally things they are responsible for. And so they're less concerned, I think, about some of the third-party privacy concerns for their customers and more about their own obligations to be responsible for these things, not wanting to take on additional risks. This leads them to have clearly the highest level of institutionalization in the document. They're talking about very clear and informed rules, very clear penalties, what would lead to cancellation of contracts. They're drawing on standards around privacy and security. They're speaking to, again, auditing their partners to ensure that they are doing what they say they are doing. And primarily doing this in a very centralized way. I think the one exemption to this is that there is still a burden on customers to understand the implications of working with some of these third parties. And I see this particularly around things like Zelle or person-to-person payment apps that exist and can interface with banks. And so that's perhaps the one caveat to the relative strength of these documents. We also see a reasonable number of rules in the healthcare sector. Again, this is probably motivated by the relative risks they perceive. A difference here between healthcare and finance is the vast number of exemptions. And so it's not a single class as with fintech. Instead, there are a litany of different options that different hospitals and clinics provide to patients where they might opt out of certain protections by choosing to use particular health apps or sharing, Fitbit data with a provider, or interestingly, the number of opportunities patients had during the pandemic to not use the HIPAA compliant licensed video conferencing tools, but rather to tell their provider they needed to be accommodated in a different way. And so these documents not only indicate that patients were using, WebEx or Zoom, which could be appropriately configured, but in some cases, there are notes that they're allowed to opt into WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger, and that raises a whole host of other concerns. I want to, just point to what some of these documents look like. They're very, very different. We see certain examples that are really structured. The University of California, San Francisco provides an example of how they classify data in their own unique way and how that serves to reconcile differences between California law, between University of California system expectations, between federal obligations, as they are, again, dealing with health data and financial data and student data and all of these different classes. This is a really helpful model because it actually forces any vendor working with UCSF to adhere to their terms and conditions, not merely modify those of their vendors. We also see examples that come from, for example, Redwood City Public Library here, where the city maintains ownership over the data and has very clear rules that data only be accessed by vendors associated with needs for technical support or for individual instances of consulting following, a follow the sun model. This is an on-demand case where there would be an exchange, but it can only be accessed from data centers in the United States and not on any portable or personal devices. We also see, small banks that are mimicking what some of the larger banks are doing in terms of classifying many of the fintech apps that their customers might use as consumer oriented, as opposed to banking or financial institutions. And so pointing out that this is more or less a transmission of data. And so highlighting where and when individuals are obligated to, for example, use something else if there are taxable records that need to be created by these things. We see, a very, very strong document that is very clear about who is responsible for what, but also allows users to do what is convenient in ways that then opt them out of some of this governance. And so you know, we see that these different processes offer a different level of on the books or as written compliance, but are serving to resolve a lot of tensions that exist in the way that we currently legislate and regulate data privacy. There are notably a lot of challenges that are still in this space in terms of thinking about disparities actually in the relative strength of protection. So another theme that emerged in this was that, for example, the hospitals that served lower incomes communities were less likely to have a strong DPA. They much more often defaulted to using a data protection addenda for health as written by a vendor than writing their own. We also saw the loopholes that spoke to, for example, using Facebook or WhatsApp in communities that were primarily non-white and rural. There are also a lot of discrepancies or tensions between stakeholder interests. And so I think the educational documents, the university documents in particular, highlighted the ways in which universities were particularly strict with certain types of vendors and then much more lax with others, probably speaking to the relative power and sort of status quo of what are typical vendors in this space. It's also challenging overall that this is an approach to data protection that places the burden on institutions to resolve the conflicts. This is sort of a stopgap measure, not a long-term solution for such issues. There are certainly strengths in not only addressing what they need to comply with, but also responding to community needs and interests. So we see, for example, I found, I think, the most interesting DPA in the whole set to be one that was negotiated by the state of Connecticut on behalf of every public school in the state to have consistent protection with respect to the vendors that served remote education needs early in the pandemic. They thought schools don't have the expertise to focus on this. There will be enormous disparities. We can avoid this, but spoke to, the sorts of concerns that weren't even regulated in their state for student privacy, and instead recognizing, it is a loophole that we don't talk about some of the sort of tech that are already in classrooms as educational technology, and that needs to happen. It's also certainly a strength that many of these documents are legally enforceable, and as a research tool, this provides a lot of transparency for what is actually collected, who has access to it, how data is protected, and so on. At the end of the day, this project is sort of pivotal. It's bringing together a lot of other data governance work that I have done, but really establishing, I think, a foundation to move forward and to think about what we can learn from these documents, and also how we can encourage organizations to appropriately negotiate what they need and reconcile these issues in absence of regulatory measures. So I'm grateful you all took the time to listen to me, and I am excited to hear from you.
So then I have the queue, and I'm keeping an eye on our virtual guests as well. And as always, we start off with a student question, if anyone has one.
Well, I'm curious. It's literally because I was just at IU Health at a provider with an IU Health last week and saw basically a data protection agreement that referenced body parts. And so I would like to, basically, and I can tell you what IU Health says. It says that you do not own any body parts that they extract from you. So, so FYI. Right, yeah, so
not at all shocking.
I never saw that before, so that's why it stood out to me. Are you seeing, we don't think of body parts as data, and yet it was in a DPA. So do DPAs also, account for non-data? Do they treat body parts and other things that are non-data as data?
Yeah, that's a
Is that
really,
becoming like this catch-all?
that's a really interesting question. So I think there are lots of examples of DPAs that I saw from the state of Illinois that referenced body parts and things that we may not, samples, specimens, things like that, that we may not think of as digital data, but certainly are medical data in a realm of interpretation. And that's a compliance measure. I would be very interested to see, specifically the terms here. I wonder if that is in part due to proximity, that they are making choices that look like what's going on in Illinois in absence of local law here, due to the potential for folks to perhaps be Illinois residents and students or employees or staff here. I don't have a good example for that, but I do think the types of data that are mentioned in these documents definitely expand far beyond the sort of digital spreadsheets that we might have in our minds. Thanks.
Stop here so they
Oh,
can
sure.
have a picture of your
Apologies.
of your head.
I'm wondering about the traditional like privacy analysis part and it's like before GPA exists and the product and the vendor agreements, we have like privacy impact assessment and clause 14 and
Yeah.
transfer impact assessment with the international data protection side. Do you think that these like privacy impact assessments or like clause 14 analysis should be in the appendix of DPAs? And
Yes.
is it should it be very effective to build the data, protection agreements or DPAs more effective between the users and the companies?
Yes, absolutely. So for those of you who maybe don't have a frame of reference here, a lot of the sort of legacy contracts and terms of service that are negotiated between these organizations and their vendors did include these mechanisms for audit and impact assessment. The challenges were in many of these cases that they didn't necessarily provide parameters about reconciling different local needs. They spoke to, here is our baseline for this sector. This is, what is appropriate for education. This is appropriate for healthcare. This is appropriate for libraries. And I think libraries are maybe the place I will choose to start this answer because in many cases, they did not have anyone who was necessarily an expert in reading those to understand it. Perhaps they could contract with a city attorney or something like that to take a cursory look at it. But typically things were agreed to without any modifications or negotiation. And that, of course, presents a problem when things come up, when they realize that what is happening is, failing X city ordinance or Y state law. The DPAs are not replacing them. They're adding to what's going on there. And so I absolutely think the impact assessments and the audits that may have already been laid out go hand in hand with these things. Many of them reference them explicitly and state, this needs to continue to happen. And these are the additional items that should be analyzed in that process in order to ensure, in particular, retention choices and where data is hosted and how it can be accessed in the long term. I think these are the sort of three parameters we see in the DPAs that are standardized to the vendor, but don't work state to state because, again, say education as an example, every state has a different expectation of how long you keep student data after they've completed a class or graduated. And those range anywhere from like delete after 30 days to must maintain this for 11 years. And those expectations are not the same. So being able to stipulate these are the terms is really key. I think another really interesting window into this is that there is sort of reciprocal verification happening between some of the vendors who are concerned about risk and some of the institutions. And so it's not just an impact assessment that the library or the hospital or the bank will do, but also the sort of verification that happens from their vendors.
Yeah, I just wanted to also like follow up with specific challenge about the transparency of DPAs and the applicability of the real world. So we have DPA, this is great, like we have like transparent contract, we have data retention and all the like risks that just addressed in the data, DPA. But in the real world, they're not applying that rules, right? So that's a huge challenge between your strength of DPAs of transparency.
Sure.
The real world.
And what actually happens. That's absolutely true. I think, you know, the DPAs that are strongest include reporting mechanisms and these verification mechanisms, because certainly lots of the libraries appear to be in name only. They've realized they need to, you know, ensure retention only happens for so long, or that, you know, there are limits to access with respect to law enforcement or things like that. But they don't ever check them. They just assume like this will be good.
Charlie?
I really liked your talk in the paper. It's great. I wanted to hear a little bit more about, given the scope of your data set, and you started off by saying I've been working on this for 5 years or more. So I kind of wanted to hear about your process,
Yeah.
going from getting the DPAs and then doing the work around the governing knowledge commons CI framework,
Yeah.
and then how you got to the comparative table at the end.
Yeah, there's a lot there. Okay, so I think the project I first started collecting the DPAs in a study of cooperative organizations and how they approached privacy and information policy issues really broadly. And some of the, for example, credit unions or rural broadband co-ops started sharing their DPAs with me through the interview process. And I was like, these are the most fascinating documents ever. I need to know more about them. And it was sort of a minor part of the project, but started being a standard question I would ask when I was conducting research interviews. And so from there were a series of projects on ed tech and on compliance to HIPAA requirements for telehealth during the pandemic around the various Trump administration executive orders and the decision not to enforce for a brief period of time. Did people actually go back to doing what they were supposed to was sort of the question there. And so a data set of, at this point, I think I gave you the paper in January, but I think it's creeped up a little bit there. I think I have about 540 US DPAs and a few hundred to 25 to 35, I'd guess, that are outside the US. Those are not in this paper at all because trying to compare all of that was a bit much. And so I sort of started to go systematically through and was coding the 8-parameter framework that integrates the institutional grammar with contextual integrity to think through, you know, the strength of these institutions, but also run computational approaches to find out where those hedges are, to find out, you know, where there are ambiguities or loopholes I might want to probe further in different projects, and to compare not just, you know, documents within a domain, but really are they doing the same thing? Does a DPA in education serve the same purpose as it does in, a non-university hospital? Does a DPA in a credit union or a major bank serve the same purpose as a public library? And I think at the end of the day, these are fundamentally about filling in gaps and resolving these conflicts that we see overall. The approaches they take are different, the relative strength of that and the nuance looks very different, but all of them are trying to solve the same problem, which is that no state or federal government entity is serving to reconcile these tensions for them, and they need to sort that out on a case-by-case basis. Some of them choose an approach and are a large enough organization to say, UCSF can say, everyone who vends with us needs to, follow this set of parameters. Many of them are not, and so they have dozens of these documents that they have to work with Zoom to do this, and they have to work with Libby, say if it's a library, or work with Zelle if it's a financial institution to sort through. So it's been, I know that there is a lot more in the data set, but this is sort of a step towards sorting through this.
Joyce?
So this is very fascinating. Thank you for your talk. First comment, I have a friend who's a senior physician at UCSF, and I have heard some data stories that would make your hair stand on end.
Excellent.
I don't think that anybody is actually following any of these lovely. I mean, it's just incredible how you can write it all down, but how does it touch, like, the question back to reality? So
Yeah.
my question actually is there, did you find in any of these like 750 or whatever DPAs, anything where it imagined that the individual was going to proffer their own terms, and add that into what the individual would allow? Because the reason I bring it up is we're working on a standard at IEEE that is basically the individual proffers their privacy terms. And so, and it's lawyer readable, machine readable, and that in that, so you can almost do like an ODR kind of approach in advance of whatever the transaction is. So you kind of can clear the way because it's known. And the model we're taking is based on Creative Commons, so that it's sort of like you just pick this license, you as the individual.
That's really interesting. So not a lot of them allow for more individualization in
Right.
this. There are a handful that were university hospitals that allowed for individual specializations or physicians to set terms with respect to particular tools or particular information flows. The example that comes to mind for this in particular is Duke University Medical Center had options for particular specialties that engaged with predictive analytics and AI in detection to set their own retention and access constraints. And there was like a form that they could fill in. So the version that I got has the blank form, and I don't know what they have done with this, but that is perhaps the only example I've seen. Yes. Yeah. I did. Obviously, many of these were collected through interviews. And so they come along with the background and insight as to, does anyone do anything with this? And I think a lot of the interviews provided information that like finance and HR are meticulously compliant with these things and that no one else is in hospital situations and in universities, and that, that sounds on brand from my experience as an academic.
Or as a patient.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
Simon?
So I find your presentation very fascinating because I think it reflects a lot of the discussion when it comes to informational capitalism and talks about how contracts itself makes our data sort of more propertized. And then there has been another way to think about this is how we define privacy itself, and the control over data has been sort of the dominant, but people have been reflecting on that viewpoint. So and I think along those lines, I'm curious to hear, because you talk on polycentricity, and I'm curious about when it comes to data governance, one important part is the aggregative nature of data, and that's when there's issues, and then unfortunately the US has a sectoral approach, then it becomes ambiguous here. So I'm curious about, do you think the economic analysis nature, or treating data maybe as common pool resource of something else, can in some way improve the discussion here to advance some sort of polycentricity of the DPA, or maybe moving forward, would that be something of a sort of like a direction that you think can build on the work here?
That's a super interesting question. I absolutely think in some of the prior work I have done on privacy and with the lens of the Governing Knowledge Commons framework, that treating data as a common pool resource can be a particularly helpful way to protect privacy, as counterintuitive as that might seem to a layperson. I don't know that helps with respect to the third-party data flows in the same way. I don't have an empirical example of that, except a project that is not mine, and I am happy to share with you, but the Swiss Me Data cooperative, which is an effort to allow sort of collective bargaining to set a price for research uses of medical data and allow Swiss patients to opt out entirely, to opt in entirely, and to take whatever the collective payments are for things that their data would be useful for, or to decide on a case-by-case basis whether or not they want to be involved. And I think the challenge with third-party data flows is really that outside of small defined populations and particular use cases, they are too diverse to there's sort of an information overload problem that I don't know how they make that decision collectively for every single one. There are so many third-party data flows that we don't ever, they're so unobtrusive that we don't ever really consider. And I like the idea of this, but this requires more research. I will share the paper.
Mike Madison is next.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, Mike.
Hello, Madeline. Great to see you. So this is fascinating. I have to say, I want to add a layer to the conversation and maybe suggest a direction for future research that's based on law, but not law, not the content of privacy law, and not the question of compliance with legal obligations, but rather law from the standpoint of lawyers. Right. So it seems to me that some of the heterogeneity in these documents, and maybe a lot of the heterogeneity from sector to sector, can be explained by were lawyers involved in negotiating them or drafting them? It's highly plausible that a lot of these things came out of just business transactions where you've got salespeople and marketing people and business people on the vendor side and IT managers of one sort or another on the data side. Or there are some situations where you've got lawyers involved on one side or the other, perhaps because the value of the transaction is significant, the scale of the transaction is significant, the durability or the length of the transaction is significant, but the lawyers are not trained in privacy law, right? You've got lawyers who look at these and are trained as commercial lawyers. right, who look at data as an asset, but not necessarily data as something that implicates privacy concerns, or for them, the privacy concerns are adjacent to the sort of financial risk associated with all this stuff. Different sectors, as you know, are more likely to have scaled up internal access to legal expertise. So if you're looking at large library systems, stereotypically, they're going to have fewer lawyers lying around than large-scale clinical healthcare systems. Universities are going to be a little bit in the middle, depending on the scale of the university, and honestly, depending on whether the university has a healthcare system attached to it. But even large-scale universities are only now starting to acquire internal central administration legal expertise that's focused on privacy. Where historically kind of privacy questions were kind of distributed to the general purpose general counsel. And then you do have some of these documents where you've got legal expertise that's got a privacy first attitude that is going to be expressed. And so, this doesn't go to your current paper, it doesn't go to the current character of the analysis, but it does down the road get into the interplay between sort of socio-legal aspects of the profession as they interact with institutionalization questions of other sorts. So to me, as a practicing lawyer from a long time ago, I can sort of see the hand of different kinds of actors at work in the variation from sector to sector and document to document.
Thank you. That is very helpful feedback and not a direction that I had particularly thought about, but I think makes a lot of sense, particularly relative to the challenges I think the librarians raised, where they were like, we have one city attorney and we will get them to look at this for an hour and that is it. That makes a tremendous amount of sense. Thank you.
Scott?
Yeah, it's just a little bit related to Mike's great point. First off, great job. It's just fantastic, right? One thing that I've been looking at a little bit more recently is this wave of like state level data privacy laws that have been kind of sweeping through the nation. And it's not really a red state, blue state thing for once, right? I mean, even states that don't have as much in common as like Indiana and Massachusetts now have more comprehensive data privacy bills in the offing, but there's definitely some differences. We copied ours from Virginia, so much so that Commonwealth was in the title up until almost the very end. But anyway, I'm wondering, like, in terms of this kind of more polycentric modeling of how this is playing out, if you could account for the now 14 states that have these laws that don't exactly look like GDPR, but they're on the way with 13 more last time I looked discussing them this cycle, right? And I'm wondering, you're right, it's not GDPR, it's not going to be anytime soon, but I mean, that's a bit of a bottom-up groundswell that lends itself maybe to some polycentric analysis. And I'm wondering if that could factor in a little bit here to how it's playing out and how it's shaping whether or not these DPAs are needed or if they need to take a different form after these laws come to force.
Yeah, I think that would be a super interesting lens through which to look at the coding results rather than sector by sector. I also have been curious, because I hand coded them, to sort of go back and look through all of the references to state laws that are outside of the state in the particular case. And there I'm wondering, was this mutually negotiated between this university or library or hospital and the vendor? And are they doing that because they assume, California is the floor that they have to follow? Now, I thank you. That's a really helpful suggestion, I think.
Amy?
Yes, two things that will help improve your paper, I think. One is, in your section on polycentricity, I noticed that some of the research by Vincent Ostrom that you cited is quite old, but he worked on it throughout his entire career. So make sure that you look at where he ended up, not just where he started. Two, you also talk about how your framework, the GKCCI framework, has been validated against the empirical legal and policy analysis. Again, I'm not a social scientist, so I had to look up what that meant. And to validate frameworks, it looks like you need to have like quite a bit of empirical data, as well as to have people across fields use your work. And these papers that you cite aren't terribly broad. They're still within this context of Internet of Things. So, again, I don't know this world as well, but to me, validated, I don't think that really helped your case here. You could say it's been gradually being used because or define what validated means in this case. Because like on Levy's paper, for instance, she used 15 interviews. That's not a lot.
So in terms of validate,
I'm talking about, okay, like I've read across the broad, like.
sure. So in terms of validate, all of the papers that are cited, conducted inter-rater reliability to validate that we were applying it consistently. So I think this is a case where it's need to be longer, but yes.
Yeah, okay, there's a piece missing. Exactly. Thank you.
Brett? I should have given him a heads up.
Oh, just unmuting. Hey, everybody. Wish I was there. I miss you guys.
Oh,
Madelyn's a great, I love this paper, by the way. I read it this morning and I was like super excited to see it. I wish I mean, a couple quick questions. So one is a couple places you use DPA to refer to the addenda, another time is data protection. I always thought it was data protection agreement, but then I was thinking addenda. So for some reason I confused to think if that meant different things in different places. I assume it doesn't, it's just a labeling thing. I guess my one question is about timing of adoption and whether as addenda to contract, a contractual addenda are sometimes sort of a binding constraint, like tying yourself to the mast or whatever kind of thing in negotiations. And this may have gone to what Mike was kind of saying earlier. And so I wondered, do you know like when they're adopted, whether they're sort of they're like sort of pre-existing and they apply to all vendors across an institute, like within an institution, or they're sort of they're part of a negotiation, because it might be that the lawyers kind of essentially reach a way to bind the marketing and vendors and professional people as they're in business development people doing stuff by just sort of saying like, whatever we do, we're always going to have this is going to be tacked on to whatever the agreement is. So whatever the vendor has in their agreements, it's always going to be superseded by a set of addenda, which works differently as a governance mechanism than if it's sort of a negotiated, something that's actually subject to negotiation by the parties. So that was one thing. It's just like the timing and who's involved kind of question. And then the second question I'll just throw out there and then I'll shut up is just, I wondered, just generally speaking, like this is like a forward-looking thing. What have you learned from this, or like how does this connect to prescriptive advice for smart cities or for other, like I was just thinking about our slow governance paper, and I was like, I wonder what this would say about slow governance, or like an approach to sort of tech deployment. So you prescriptively give advice about what to do. I realize that's not this paper, but I'm just curious like what lessons you might learn.
Okay, so to the first question, half of them I think were negotiated on a case-by-case basis. And many of those documents even included, timestamps of when it had been updated and in response to what. And so there was pretty clear context to be able to evaluate that. In those cases, I did not count it as a separate agreement. I simply have multiple versions and consider it, the same for comparative purposes. Obviously, individually want to look at both of those. The others certainly are falling into this category where they're sort of, these are our terms that you must follow, and this is kind of being tacked on as opposed to negotiated on a case-by-case basis. And so I do think that's perhaps another way to compare them and to think about the relative strength and enforceability versus what looks like, a set of strategic aims of things we would like to happen, but don't necessarily have a means to enforce. In terms of, other potential use cases, I think that in the long term or medium term, I should say, in the long term, I would hope this could actually be reconciled. But in the medium term, I think thinking through how best practices can be surfaced here in order to help different types of organizations use this is key. I have not found a lot of these that speak to, smart intersections or, surveillance cameras in public transit or different sorts of things that we might think about with respect to smart cities. Instead, when I see these being negotiated by the public sector, they're typically, you know, a state, Connecticut's doing this for their schools, or you know, there is a state libraries association that has negotiated this for multiple institutions. I'm not sure how much these are being used with respect to hardware in other cases, because literally none of them are about hardware in the instances that I've looked at. They're all focused on software or literally data storage that is generated by the institution. And I think that's a really interesting question and a good place to go in future directions, because you can imagine, you know, the smart lamp posts and the sensors that determine, you know, movement in a bike lane to change a directional sign have pretty standard terms of service. They're not things that appear to be negotiated case by case. And so I would be really curious to follow up what we've done to think that through.
We are officially out of time. And so, of course, she's hanging around and is happy to answer questions from here. And I'm happy to leave the Zoom link on if I just skipped anyone as well. But let's thank Madelyn for the one.